Section 12 of Great Events in the History of North and South America. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Great Events in the History of North and South America by Charles Goodrich. United States Indians, Their Tribes and Wars, Virginia Indian Wars. The intercourse of the colonists in Virginia with the Indians was not altogether such as to secure their friendship. Difficulties arose, which were settled only by a resort to wars and massacres. The earlier colonists either returned to their native land, were destroyed by famine, or were cut off by violence. The whole scheme of colonizing was, at first, a series of mismanagement or misfortune. The earliest attempt at settlement under the captains Amadis and Barlow in 1684 was abortive. It is related that the English, after landing on an island called by the Indians Wacocan, saw none of the natives until the third day, when 3 were observed in a canoe. One of them came on shore, and the English went to him. He was not at all intimidated, but spoke much to them, and then went fearlessly on board the vessels. The whites, after making him some presents, received some food in return. Wingina, chief of the Indians in that place, never had much faith in the good intentions of the English, and to him was mainly attributed the breaking up of the colony. They were disposed to return home, having made no serious attempt at settlement. The next colony which proceeded to Virginia was conducted by Sir Richard Grenville in 1685. He had the imprudence to commit an outrage upon the natives, which occasioned at length the breaking up of the colony of 108 men, whom he left behind him. He burned an Indian town in revenge of a petty theft, which some native committed upon him. Ralph Lane, who was governor, became justly chargeable with very reprehensible conduct. He put to death some of the natives on the most frivolous charges, and it is no wonder that the animosity of the Indians was aroused, and that the small band of adventurers were so discomfited as to seek a return to England. No attempt to settle Virginia had succeeded up to the year 1607. The ill-advised schemes of the company or their controversies, and the suspicions and hatred of the Indians, had defeated every enterprise hitherto. But one man, Captain Smith, by his sagacity and heroism, at length accomplished the object of his adventures. No particular account needs to be given here, as these have been narrated in another part of this work. But his connection with Powhatan affords the occasion of bringing the latter more especially into view in this place. This chief is described as being tall and well-proportioned, wearing an aspect of sadness, exceedingly vigorous, and possessing a body fitted to endure great hardships. At the time of the settlement of Jamestown, he was about 60 years of age, and rendered the more majestic by the greyness of his hair. He inspired the awe of beholders as he was seated on his wooden form, and adorned with his robe of raccoon skins, and his headdress of various feathers having the appearance of a crown. He governed many nations, and many of them by the right of conquest. The place of his residence at first was at Powhatan, near the falls of James River, but afterwards, when he had extended his conquest north, it was at a place called Warro-Woco-Moco. His dominion included the country upon James River, from its mouth to the falls and all its tributary streams. This was the boundary of his country southernly, and thus across the territory, nearly as high as the falls of all the great rivers over the Potomac, even to Patuxent in Maryland. He usually kept a guard, consisting of 40 or 50 of his bravest men, especially when he slept. But this number was fourfold after the arrival of the English. His wives were numerous, and taken or dismissed at his pleasure. When he slept, One sat at his head and another at his feet. His places for temporary residence, or at a certain season of the year, were numerous. At these places he had victuals provided against his coming, in spacious wigwams 30 or 40 yards in extent. His manner of attack upon his neighbors was stealthily and fiercely cruel. An instance is given in his surprisal, on one occasion, of the people of Peyacatic, who were his neighbors and subjects. To effect his barbarous purpose, he sent several of his men to lodge with them the night on which he designed an attack. Then, secretly surrounding them in their wigwams, commenced a horrid massacre. Many of the men were killed, their scalps taken, and the women and children made prisoners. The scalps were exhibited upon a line between the 2 trees as a trophy, and the chief Abigail and his wife Powhatan became servants of the emperor. Through Captain Smith's address, this prince was now brought completely into the English interest, although eventually through the imprudent conduct of Newport, who soon after arrived from England, he was induced to practice deception upon his new friends in the way of trade. Smith, however, in his turn, took advantage of the emperor, to the no great credit of his moral principles. The revenge was complete, as the following example shows. Smith gained his end fully by pretending to set a great value on a few blue beads, which he had exposed to Powhatan as if by accident, and which he professed to be very unwilling to part with, as they were worn, according to his account, only by great kings. This fired the emperor with the wish to secure them, at whatever sacrifice on his part. In the infatuation produced, he parted with 200 or 300 bushels of corn for a pound or 2 of beads. Thus the intercourse of the whites with these simple children of nature in the early period of our history was not always marked with that delicate regard of right and veracity with which every transaction of this nature should be attended. The consequences very naturally appeared in the many plots and counterplots which were contrived to embarrass one another, or to effect unlawful objects. On one occasion, Powhatan became offended with Smith, because he could not procure swords from him in the manner in which he procured them from Newport. When the latter was about leaving the country, Powhatan sent him 20 turkeys, for which he demanded and obtained 20 swords in return. He supposed that he could do the same with Smith, but was disappointed, and accordingly he ordered his men to seize the English wherever they could find them. The consequence was that many of the latter in the vicinity of the forts were robbed of their swords. These depredations were continued until Smith surprised a number of the Indians, from whom he learned that Powhatan was endeavoring to get all the arms in his power, with a view to massacre the whites. When the chief found that his plot was discovered, he sent Pocahontas his daughter with gifts in order to apologize for his conduct, and pretended that the mischief was done by some of his chiefs. He directed her to use her influence in effecting the release of his men, in which he succeeded, and thus the parties became at peace again. The friendship which Powhatan manifested towards the English at any time was short-lived, and seems not to have been at all sincere. Constant deceptions were practiced by him to gain his ends, and so long as he lived, difficulties existed between him and the English. The noble Pocahontas was a sort of mediator between them, and often brought important intelligence as seasonable aid to the latter. On one occasion, after a long conference in regard to a trade in provisions, in which deceptions were employed on both sides, and in which Powhatan endeavored to persuade Captain Smith and his men to treat with him in a friendly manner, and throw aside their arms, Smith was about to resort to force in order to effect his object. Powhatan, however, succeeded in escaping from the conference, and in conveying his women, children, and effects into the woods. Even then he attempted to allure Smith into his presence unarmed, if possible, by sending him a present. Finding at last all artifices without effect, Powhatan resolved to fall upon the English in their cabins on the following night. But here Pocahontas interposed her kind offices, and was the means, most probably, of saving the life of Smith and his attendants. She came alone in a dark night through the woods, and apprised Smith of her father's design. For such a favor, Smith offered her whatever article she would please to accept, but she declined taking anything, and with tears in her eyes, remarked that if her father should see her with anything, he would suspect what she had done, and instantly kill her. She then retired as she came through the dismal forest. After Smith's final departure from Virginia, the Emperor's animosity against the whites was confirmed, as the English successor in the government, Lord Delaware, was much less cautious and moderate in his measures with the Indians, severe as Smith's treatment of them was at times. The new governor, finding Powhatan not disposed to yield to his demands, proceeded to an act of horrid barbarity. Having got into his power an Indian prisoner, his lordship caused his right hand to be cut off. In this shocking condition, he sent the poor creature to Powhatan. At the same time, he gave the sachem to understand that he would serve all the Indians in that manner if they refused obedience any longer, and that he would destroy all the corn, which was then near to the harvest. Powhatan consequently could not but feel the most burning indignation against the Englishman. 2 years after Smith left Virginia, that is, in 1611, Captain Argyle treacherously took the king's daughter prisoner, with a view to prevent him from doing any injury to the English, as also to extort a large ransom from him, and such terms of peace as they should prescribe. On being informed of the captivity of Pocahontas, connected with the demand that he should restore to the English their men, guns, and tools, taken at different times by the Indians, the stern and wary chief became greatly embarrassed, and knew not what to do. They did not hear from him until at the expiration of 3 months, when he complied with their demand only in part. This did not satisfy Argyle. The demand in full was reiterated, but Powhatan was again for a long time silent. The result was that in a year or two, Sir Thomas Dale took Pocahontas to the residence of her father, in hopes to effect an exchange and bring about a peace. Powhatan was absent from home, and the party met with no kindly reception from the Indians, who seemed to take the presence of the English in dudgeon. The latter burned many of their Indian habitations, and gave out threats of other vengeance. This had the effect of inducing some of the Indians to come and make peace, as they called it. Pocahontas had then an opportunity of seeing 2 of her brothers, which gave her unbounded joy. After the marriage of this excellent Indian woman to Mr. Walt, the whites experienced less trouble from Powhatan, though it is believed that they were never entirely exempt from the effects of his policy or his power. The successors of Powhatan were, first, Oppet Chapin, and next, Oppen Cano, both brothers of the emperor. Such was the law of the succession. The first named chiefs seems never to have been noted for any distinguishing quality, but is spoken of as being feeble and decrepit. He compared unfavorably with his brother, who in the council and in the field was the most conspicuous personage among the Powhatans. He had, during the lifetime of the late emperor, procured from the free tribe of the Chickahominies the title of their king. It was Oppen Cano, who figured so disastrously in the great massacre of the whites on the 22nd March, 1622, which has been narrated in another place. It was kept a profound secret during 4 years, and burst upon the settlement like a bolt from heaven. In the vengeance with which the English followed this act of treachery and blood, it was for some time supposed that Opencanoe was among the killed. But if history does not misguide us, the same Sachem 22 years afterwards executed a still greater massacre upon the English. It is not known how long he had been plotting the extirpation of the whites, but in 1644 all the Indians over the space of country, 600 miles in extent, were joined in the enterprise. The governor and council had appointed a fast day to be kept through the country upon Good Friday with the success of the king. On the day before the intended fast, Opencanoe, borne in a litter, led his warriors forward and connected the work of death. He is supposed to be near 100 years old at this time. The massacre commenced in the outparts of the circumjacent country and continued 2 days. The Indians fell suddenly upon the inhabitants and killed all indiscriminately, to the number of 300. Their progress was checked by the arrival of Sir William Berkeley at the head of an armed force. Subsequently to this massacre, the date has not been ascertained, this bloody chief was taken prisoner. Sir William intended to send him as a present to the King of England. He was, however, prevented from doing it by the assassination of Opencanoe. The soldier who was appointed to guard him fired upon him and inflicted a mortal wound, it having been, as was supposed, an act of private revenge. Just before the old chief expired, hearing a great noise and crowd around him, he ordered an attendant to lift up his eyelids, as from age and fatigue the elasticity of his muscles was in a great degree impaired. When he discovered a multitude pressing around him, to gratify the morbid desire of beholding a dying Sachem, aroused with indignation and little fearing death, he seemed to disregard the crowd, but raising himself from the ground in the spirit of his wonted authority, commanded that the governor should be called to him. When the latter came, the chief uttered in his hearing the impassioned remark, "Had it been my fortune to have taken Sir William Berkeley prisoner, I would not meanly have exposed him as a show to my people," and soon after expired. An Indian, whom they afterward had seized as prisoner, confessed that they attempted his destruction of the English, because they saw the latter took up all their lands from them and would drive them out of the country. And they took this season, but they understood that they were at war in England, and began to go to war among themselves. These intrusions upon the Indian territory were, however, conformable to the grants of the proprietors, the Indians. Opencanoe could hardly have expected an entire conquest, as his people had already begun to melt away, and the villages of the English planters were springing up over an extent of country of over 500 miles, with a comparatively large population. Nicaraguan succeeded Opencanoe as a tributary to the English. In 1648, he came to Jamestown in company with several other chiefs, and brought a number of beaver skins to be sent to the English king. He delivered a prolonged address, which he concluded with the protestation that the sun and the moon should first lose their glorious lights and shining before he or his people should ever more wrong the English. The successor of this chief is supposed to have been Totopotomo, as he was king of Pamunkey in 1656. In that year, a body of western or inland Indians, to the number of 600 or 700, came down from the mountainous country and took possession of the territory about the falls of James River. This fact coming to the knowledge of the legislature of Virginia, which was then in session, it was resolved to dislodge the Indians from their new location, as their situation and proximity were considered dangerous to the whites. The war seems not to have been attended with any success on the part of the colony. The English leader with 100 men, and Totopotomo with 100 of his warriors, suffered extremely in an engagement. It appears, however, that a peace was not long after concluded with the Indians. A renowned warrior, Nemetanah, not having been mentioned in the proper order of time, may be introduced here. He was supposed to have an agency in bringing about the Great Massacre of 1622. He was, however, an object of jealousy to Opechancanough, the leader in the tragedy, on account of his popularity among his countrymen. He is said to have been an eccentric and vain person, being wont to dress himself up in strange attire and barbaric fashion with feathers, on which account he obtained the name of Jack of the Feather. As he had been engaged in many fights with the English, and, though particularly exposed, had never received a wound, he was considered by the Indians to be invulnerable. The cause and manner of his fate were the following. Only about 14 days before the massacre, Jack of the Feather went to the house of one Morgan, where he saw many such articles exhibited as were calculated to excite admiration in such people. Jack, perhaps, had not the means to purchase, but it seems he was resolved somehow or other to possess them. He therefore told Morgan that if he would take his commodities to Pamunkey, the Indians would give him a great price for them. Not in the least mistrusting the design of Nemetanah, the simple Englishman set out for Pamunkey in company with the Indian. This was the last the English ever heard of Morgan. However strange it may seem, Jack's ill-directing fate sent him to the same place again, and what was still more strange, he had the cap of the murdered Morgan upon his head. Morgan's servants asked him where their master was, who very deliberately answered that he was dead. This satisfied them that he had murdered him. They therefore seized him in order to take him before a magistrate at Berkeley, but he made a good deal of resistance, which caused one of the captors to shoot him down. The singular part of the tragedy is yet to be related. Though mortally wounded, Nemetanah was not killed outright, and his captors, which were two stout young men, got him into a boat to proceed to Mr. Thorpe's, the magistrate. As they were going, the warrior became satisfied that he must die, and with the most extraordinary earnestness besought that two things might be granted him. One was, that it should never be told to his countrymen that he was killed by a bullet, and the other, that he should be buried among the English, so that it should never be discovered that he had died, or was subject to death like other men. Such was the pride and vanity exhibited by an Indian at his death. From the preceding brief notices of the hostile bearing of the savage tribes towards the early Southern planters, it will be apparent that the colonization of that portion of America was no easy matter. The jealousy of the Indians towards their new neighbors was soon excited, nor did the conduct of the colonists serve to allay but rather to increase it. The cruelty and vindictiveness of the Indians cannot be justified, but in their circumstances may be found, perhaps, some small apology. This was their country. They were proprietors of the soil. Here they lived. Here were their altars. Here their fathers' sepulchres. And they regarded them with the veneration and love of which they were capable. Who can blame them? Who censure their feelings, that patriotism, the love of liberty, which, when found among civilized nations, are highly extolled? Among the Indian chiefs there were men of no small sagacity, who, foreseeing the consequences to themselves and people of the drift and extension of the English, can it be deemed strange that their anticipations were most sad, or that they should adopt every expedient which seemed likely to avert calamities to them most fearful? End of section 12.